Promenade. I lift my pen with a sorrowful heart to inform you of the death of your dear father, and may I say mine, for he has been a father, and as a father unto me. He departed this life on Saturday morning at 20 minutes before 6 o'clock. He died without a struggle. 10 minutes before he died, he asked Mother if she saw the chosen ones around her. She said she did not, and in a little he clasped his hands together and said these words, "Glory, glory, glory," and then gave up the ghost. Uncle, we have lost a good friend and a good advisor and a good father. This precedes any kind of, what do you call them, the public records. So this is the only way that we knew when Robert died. You won't find a death certificate anywhere, but buried in the letters we have the story of his death. He also quickly adds that he wants to say he would have written on Saturday, but he knew that the Reverend James was preparing his sermon and he didn't want to disturb him for his Sunday service. There's one final letter in this collection, and it's also written by Alex, and I'll bore you with another chunk of it because it gives a clue to what happened to Brother John. He says, "We received your ably written book this morning, and though it was Sabbath morning, we had read a good piece of it. Will you be so good as to tell us if we are right in thinking that it is Uncle John who is the subject of your remarks in the Scenes of the Wood? As soon as I had read about the man with his father's Bible, it being Poole's and Berger's sermons, then Grandmother exclaimed, 'It is John! But has Uncle John 4 children buried? We are all very proud of it. Grandmother says it's an excellent book. Mother says it's a very fine book. And as for me, I was so engaged with it that I could not stop reading it to go to church. And to tell you the truth, there was none of us at the church today, but you had better not tell Mr. Harvey about it.' The Reverend James would add 2 more children to his family while in Edinburgh, a son James, and yes, another daughter Margaret. Before deciding to relocate the family to London, somewhere around 1845, during the times, I believe, of the Great Disruption, and it was kind of the changes in the Relief Church. There was a lot of changes going on up here, and he decided to go and reinvent himself down in London as a freelance Congregationalist minister. He ended up settling in East Grinstead and became friends with the Reverend John Mason Neale, who is probably well known as one of the best hymn writers of the 19th century. His most famous work is Good King Wenceslaus, and he was a dyed-in-the-wool Anglican, and my kind of Calvinist-based great-great-grandfather became great friends and started a local philosophical society and delivered many lectures on many topics in the area. When the Reverend James died in 1858, it was John Mason Neale who was at his deathbed. It's recounted in his memoirs, and he nursed him through what was a very painful death, having suffered a fall when he was out hill walking in Cumbria. What can I say? What became of these children, and where do they fit into what I call the grand Victorian scheme of things? Well, we know that Janet, the first girl, died as an infant and is buried in Edinburgh. Robert, the first son, grew up to become a sea captain and plied his trade up and down the African coast, only to succumb to yellow fever, and he's buried in Old Calabar in what is now Nigeria, around the time of when Mary Slessor, the great missionary, was doing her work there, and I like to think the 2 of them might have had tea together and swapped stories about old Scotland. The second daughter, Agnes, is quite interesting. She married another ship's captain, J.J. White, and he moved his entire family, parents, brothers, children, everybody, and they went to Australia, and they settled in Footscray and plied the merchant shipping business and became incredibly wealthy down in Australia. When Agnes died, J.J. was so overcome with grief that he had this incredible memorial fountain dedicated to her in the cemetery in Williamstown, which is right next to Footscray. And when he died in 1917, he left money in his will to have an entire wing built at the local hospital and dedicated to Agnes's memory. So once again, it's the women in the family, female Turnbulls you don't hear about much, and they recently did a centennial restoration of that wing and invited descendants of Agnes Fairbairn Turnbull to come, and as she and her husband only had girls, once again, those descendants came and joined them for the celebration. They sent me pictures. It was absolutely lovely. The third child would have been James, who served as a chemist's assistant down in Horley. Unfortunately, he died from tuberculosis as a young man, which was rampant in the area at the time, and he never married. The third daughter, Margaret, married Thomas Martin, who was an East Grinstead shoemaker. I suspect, knowing my pretentious family, that was probably considered beneath her, and she unfortunately died in childbirth with their first child. And she's not included on the big family memorial in Crawley Down, but instead is buried in a much simpler grave right next to it. And I suspect, knowing my family, they have this big, ornate, Scottish-based stone monument to the Turnbulls, and she's not included on it. So there's a story in there, I don't know exactly what it is. And the youngest son, Edward, was born in England itself, and he was my great-grandfather. He ended up being basically the only surviving child, and he got the wealth of the estate from the Reverend James, from his good, shrewd investments and his properties that he invested in up at Edinburgh, so that Edward, the story in the family is that Edward went to work one day, didn't like it very much, and he went home and decided to live off of the family money. He married, this goes back to the story, he married the daughter of gypsies. He had 5 sons, one of which was my grandfather Ken, and then died an untimely death at the age of 50, having just about gone through the entire family fortune. I suppose that's the way to go. The interesting thing is, I keep talking about these women and I'm supposed to be the only female. My grandfather Ken had a brother Rob, who was the only other brother to marry, and Rob had a daughter named Kitty. And I suspect that whenever my family would roll out the story that I was the first girl born in 200 years, Kitty would just, roll her eyes and think, oh my goodness, what are they talking about? When Rob got married, his mother was so offended that she cut them out of the family, and they were completely dismissed. And so we knew Kitty growing up, but every time my parents would say the story, it never occurred to us that, excuse me, Kitty was born before me. She therefore must have been, there must have been other girls born in the family. And it's thanks to Kitty that we have things such as these letters in the family Bible, because she's the one who preserved it. In fact, Kitty was a great genealogist, and Kitty was here for the very first Turnbull gathering. If you look at the pictures in the old newsletters, Kitty is there. She never married. She traveled the world. She was a marvelous independent woman, and she instilled in us a love of the Turnbull clan and got us all involved in it, ultimately. There's one other, a couple of others hanging out there. We have Robert's sister Elizabeth, who's a mystery. I know when she died. I know that she stayed in the house in Bridgeton. Her son Alex went on to become what's known as a journeyman baker. And with the incredible industrialization in Glasgow at the end of the 19th century, he was out of work as an artisan baker. And he lived in a flat right around the corner from where the old Turnbull house had been in Bridgeton, and tragically died in a fire in the flat, and is buried in an unmarked grave. So I've discovered where the grave is. I'm on a mission now to get him a marker, because he wrote a lot of these letters and they're quite lovely, and he was so excited, and you see this young man, just wanting to take on life and to end in such a sad way. It's kind of unfortunate. But there is the other brother, John, who went to Canada. He was trickier to track down because I didn't really know where he went, and the only hints I had was this William Stevenson who had conveyed the letter to him. But it just so happens that I found a family history prepared by Theodore Pringle Loblaw. Isn't that a great Scottish name? Or do we have Canadians here? Anybody? Yeah. Okay. If you know the Loblaw's grocery chain, Theodore Pringle Loblaw was the founder of that chain. And he was also the grandson of William Stevenson. In fact, it was the Stevensons that raised him, and he was so proud of his Scottish heritage that he wrote a family history that includes his other great-grandfather, John Turnbull, because John Turnbull's son Robert married William Stevenson's daughter Mary, and they formed an incredible Turnbull clan I never knew we were related to, who spread all throughout Canada and came down through New York and Wisconsin and into North America. And funnily enough, at the original Turning of the Bull dedication, one of his descendants was at that event, and Dorothy and I became fast friends at the time because we had no idea that we were really so closely related. Here I have labored for years thinking, oh, we're not related to any Turnbulls that we come across. And there she was right here in Hoyt. In his genealogical history that he prepared, he tells a little story of John, which I'll just relay to you because I think it's very sweet. He says, in 1836, Granddaddy and Grandmother Turnbull, with their family of 6 children, Uncle Robert then being the youngest and only 6 months old, made the journey from Kingston, which is where they had originally settled, with 1 horse and a wagon, and settled on the northeast corner, which was later known as West Essa Corner or Turnbull Corners. This is north of Toronto, which farm I was able to purchase. We have the 3 volumes here of Granddaddy Turnbull's old Bible, which he brought from Scotland, and which is now covered with the hide of Old Fan, the horse that brought them up from Kingston. These volumes were given to me by his grandson William Turnbull, to whom I am greatly indebted. The old family farm exists today as a B&B. It's the Stevenson Family Farm B&B. If you ever want a place to go to have a little Turnbull gathering in Canada, you can go there. And that Bible, the 3 volumes, are in the display case in the front room in the B&B. That's the same Bible that young Alex was all excited about and writing about from the story that he read from the Reverend Turnbull's book. There's always been one other mystery to solve in the family, and that is old Robert's brother John, born in 1748 and listed in the original family Bible. He may be, Albert and I argue about it, but he may be the first John Turnbull who went to Australia and founded a long line of Turnbulls that includes the most recent former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. Albert is convinced of this after many years. He was surprised when I showed him the Bible. He fits nicely with a pattern that they've been looking for, but we need some DNA to find out. So if anybody descends from that line of Turnbulls, and I'm working on it gradually, I'll find somebody to see if they match either me or Wally, then it's probably correct that he is, and that's been one of the great mysteries in Turnbull searching. So remember the 3 things I talked about at the beginning of my story, that I descend from the Reverend James, I didn't have any relatives in North America, and I was the first girl born in 200 years in the family? Well, the first one is undoubtedly true, but through DNA we know we can go much further back, certainly to 1715, and once you hook in there through the pattern that emerges, it's very clearly that we have a straight line all the way back to the original Turnbull. Myths number 2 and 3 are undoubtedly not true. So what did I learn from this story, and what are these lessons that can apply to all of you? First, don't rely on a single source. We have this beautiful Bible chronicling 250 years of family history, but it wasn't until we read the letters that brought color to their lives that we learned of more family. And until we found records of births and deaths, it may have been hard to talk about, and until we were able to use the magic of genetics to verify it all. Number 2, people are imperfect. We don't know the reasons that the scribes of our history had to leave close relatives out. Were they misogynists, which is what I always tell people? Did they even know of the relatives? Was there some family secret that pushed them away? Just remember that our ancestors were people too, with their own imperfections, with their own biases, and with their own human nature. And third, there's always another mystery. Whether it's finding out about great aunts and uncles that you never knew, or if it's stepping back further in time to see another layer of great-grandparents. The beauty of genealogy is that the work is never done and the puzzle is never solved.
Well said.